It all started on a clear summer morning, a day like any other, or so I thought. My husband and I lived in a sprawling old house at the end of a quiet lane, its sloping roof and old fashioned gables silhouetted against a pale blue sky. The property itself was large, too large for just the two of us, with an expansive back garden that seemed to stretch on forever. The garden was my husband's pride and joy. He planted neat rows of roses and marigolds near the patio, grew herbs in a small raised bed, and spent hours nurturing a wildflower patch at the far end. He loved that garden more than anything, spending every spare minute weeding, watering, and whispering gentle encouragement to the green world he tended. I often joked about how the garden looked like it belonged in a horticulture magazine: perfect hedges, lush greenery, the faint scent of lavender drifting in the breeze. But my husband never took credit. He said nature did all the work. He was just there to help it along. I never doubted his sincerity. That morning, as I stirred my coffee at the kitchen table, my husband mentioned that he'd need to put in extra hours in the garden. Something about a creeping vine infestation near the back fence and a stubborn patch of soil that wouldn't yield. He said he might be out there until well after sunset. Normally, he finished by dinner time, but I shrugged, no matter. I trusted him, and I had reading and chores to occupy myself indoors. He kissed my forehead and stepped outside. The kitchen window offered a perfect view as he strode down the flagstone path, gardening shears in hand, disappearing behind a tall hedge. The day passed uneventfully at first. I dusted shelves, rearranged some old photo frames, and browsed through a few magazines. The sound of distant birdsong filtered through open windows, mixed with the dull hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. Hours drifted by. By late afternoon, I felt drowsy, lulled by the soft warmth of the summer light. I decided to lie down in our bedroom for a short nap. My husband was still hard at work outside. I could imagine the faint sound of him moving tools, muttering under his breath as he wrestled with the stubborn earth. I fell asleep without intending to sleep long, but who can predict these things? I only know that at some point I was jolted awake by a piercing scream, sharp and terrified. My heart hammered. I sat up, blinking in confusion. Night had settled, or nearly so. The room was dim, the sky outside a dusky purple. I heard frantic voices, the rustle of leaves, footsteps on gravel. Without thinking, I rushed to the nearest window that overlooked the back garden. Just visible beyond the glass were shapes moving, silhouettes in the twilight. Someone shouted my name, or I think they did, but I couldn't make out who. Another scream echoed. This time I realized it was my neighbor's voice. "There's a face! A face!" he cried, panic and disbelief woven into every syllable. I felt a sickening chill and ran downstairs, heart in my throat. I yanked open the back door and stepped onto the patio. The garden, lit by a thin moon and the amber glow of a few solar lamps, seemed both familiar and deeply wrong. Our neighbors were there, Mr. and Mrs. Paulson from next door, standing near one of the raised beds. Their eyes were wide, hands trembling. They were staring at something on the ground. But when I followed their gaze, I saw nothing but scattered tools and a half-dug hole in the soil. My husband's voice cut through the silence, strained and shaky. "Don't come here," he shouted, and it was an unfamiliar tone coming from him. Sharp, fearful, commanding. But I couldn't help myself. I took a few steps forward, and the Paulsons turned to face me. Mr. Paulson's face was pale as ash. Mrs. Paulson looked like she might faint. I forced my way around them and saw my husband leaning against a short wooden post, his shoulders heaving as though he had run a marathon. His eyes darted nervously, and he clutched a small garden trowel in one hand, knuckles white. I asked him what happened. My voice sounded thin and too loud in the tense silence. He shook his head, tears glittering at the corners of his eyes. He looked as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't. Our neighbors tried to help. Mrs. Paulson offered a few words. He... We heard a scream from your garden, so we came to check. Your husband yelled something about a face? She glanced at me uncertainly, like she hoped I had an explanation. A face? A face in the garden? I looked around, puzzled. There was nothing. Just dirt, plants, tools. My husband collapsed onto his knees, hands shaking uncontrollably, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked utterly terrified. I knelt beside him, tried to steady him. The Paulsons hovered, concerned but clueless. My husband wouldn't answer any questions. Instead, he just stared at the patch of ground near the back fence where the soil was freshly disturbed, as if something horrible had been there moments before. Eventually, we all retreated inside. The Paulsons, shaken, left soon after, whispering apologies and confusion. My husband sat hunched at the kitchen table, refusing to meet my eyes. I begged him to tell me what he saw, what happened out there, but he only shook his head. The silence between us was heavy and bitter. Finally, he managed a weak excuse. I must have been imagining things. I didn't believe him. That night, I barely slept. My husband tossed and turned, caught in nightmares so vivid he mumbled and whimpered in his sleep. I tried to wake him, tried to comfort him, but he pulled away. When morning light broke through the curtains, he was gone. Not gone from the house, no, just sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the window. He looked haunted. From that day onward, he changed. He still tended the garden, but never with the same enthusiasm. His hands shook when he handled the trowel, and he avoided going near the back fence after dusk. I caught him many times, gazing out there with dread. He never explained what he saw. Our neighbors kept their distance too. They had seen his reaction. They had heard his cry. "There's a face," the neighbor had shouted. A face. But of what? The nightmares continued. Every night my husband would toss and thrash, waking drenched in sweat, stammering apologies. I begged him again and again to talk to me, to let me help. He refused. He grew thinner, paler. Sometimes I woke up at odd hours to find him standing at the bedroom window looking at the garden with hollow eyes. I began to fear for his health, his mind. 6 months passed, each day more strained than the last. I watched my husband fade into a shadow of his former self. He who once laughed at butterflies landing on his gloves, who hummed while trimming hedges, now rarely spoke. He ate little, barely slept, just drifted through each day as though burdened by an unbearable secret. Then came the day he didn't wake up. 6 months to the day after that horrible evening, I found him in bed, cold and still. The doctor said heart failure, maybe stress. I was numb, hollowed out by grief and confusion. I buried him quietly, with just a few friends and neighbors. The Paulsons were there offering condolences, eyes filled with pity. I could barely look at them without recalling that night, the scream, the mention of a face. Alone in that big, silent house, I felt trapped. Every corner reminded me of him. Every window offered a glimpse of the garden he once loved. I couldn't stay. Within weeks, I put the house on the market and arranged to live with my family in the next town. Before I left, I had a quiet moment with Mrs. Paulson, who had insisted on helping me pack a few boxes of kitchenware. We stood in the kitchen, that same kitchen where he had once insisted he was just imagining things. She lowered her voice and said, "There's something I never told you. That night, when we heard the scream." She hesitated, looking at her feet. "Your husband wasn't the only one who saw something. My husband caught a glimpse too. He told me after you went inside." My heart pounded. "What did he see?" Mrs. Paulson sighed, trembling slightly. "He said he saw a face. At first he thought maybe it was a mask, leathery, brownish, with eyes that didn't look human. He said it looked so real, like it wasn't made by human hands. He's too embarrassed to admit it to anyone else, but he swears it was no trick of the light." A cold dread filled me. I asked, "And then it just vanished?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, by the time we approached it was gone. Either it ran off or your husband." She paused, clearly uneasy. "Your husband might have hidden it or buried it. Who knows what he did while we were panicking? Maybe he thought he could protect us all by hiding the truth." I stared through the window at the garden, overgrown now with a few weeks of neglect. If something had been buried there, something monstrous or unearthly, I would never know. The soil would keep its secrets, and my husband had carried them to his grave. I left that house a few days later, passing it on to a buyer who asked few questions. The Paulsons waved goodbye, and I could see in their eyes relief that the chapter might finally close. Yet, as I drove away, I couldn't help imagining a silent shape buried deep in the cool earth, a face waiting, sealed off from the world above. In my new home with my family, I tried to rebuild a life. But late at night, I often wake from half-remembered dreams of my husband's trembling voice and a patch of disturbed earth behind the old house. I wonder if the nightmares that tormented him were visions of that impossible face. Perhaps it taunted him each night, showed him horrors beyond reason. and that final question remains. What did he see, and what did he do to ensure we'd never find it? I will never know for certain. The neighbor's words echo in my mind, a face that looks so real it couldn't be fake. Whether demon or cryptic creature, a hallucination or a twisted joke, its memory lingers like a dark stain on my past. As the seasons turn and I try to move on, I can only hope that what lies buried remains undisturbed, forever hidden from prying eyes. For if my husband's silence and the neighbor's terror are any indication, some truths are better left unearthed.